1:47 in the morning. The camera goes dark, not because it failed, because someone made it go dark. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. 41 minutes later, at 2:28, an 84-year-old woman's pacemaker stops transmitting. Between those two moments, something happened inside a quiet home in Catalina Foothills, Arizona. Something deliberate. Something that left blood on the porch, a door propped open, and critical medication sitting untouched on the counter. Medication that Nancy Guthrie needed to survive. She vanished in her pajamas. No coat, no phone, no keys. And the last person confirmed to see her alive was someone she trusted completely. Her own son-in-law. This is not a story about what we know. This is a story about what 41 minutes can hide. If you want to see how investigators are piecing together one of the most methodical disappearances in recent memory, you need to subscribe to True Crime Files right now. Hit that like button, because what you're about to hear will change the way you think about preparation, pattern, and the distance someone will go to make a person disappear. 63 days. That is how long Nancy Guthrie has been missing. 63 days since an elderly woman who had lived in the same Tucson neighborhood for years simply ceased to exist in the physical world. But she did not vanish into chaos. She vanished into structure. And structure is what makes this case so unsettling. Because when you examine the timeline, when you trace the digital footprints, when you map the cellular data and reconstruct the movements, you do not see randomness. You see design. February 1st, 2025. Catalina Foothills, a neighborhood where people notice things, where routines matter, where unfamiliar cars get second looks, and unusual activity does not go unobserved for long. This is not the kind of place where someone just disappears. And yet, Nancy Guthrie did exactly that. But the more investigators dug into the circumstances surrounding that night, the more they realized something critical. This was not about what happened that night. This was about what had been happening for weeks before. Let's go back to the beginning. Not February 1st, earlier. Because if you want to understand how someone vanishes from a controlled environment, without forced entry, without witnesses, without leaving a trail that leads anywhere conclusive, you have to understand preparation. And preparation always leaves traces. You just have to know where to look. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She was not a transient. She was not someone living on the margins. She had family. She had a home she had lived in for years. She had routines, relationships, a life that was predictable in the way most lives become predictable at that age. She required a pacemaker to regulate her heart. She needed daily medication to stay alive. Those two facts alone tell you something important. Nancy could not just walk away. Her body would not allow it. Which means, if she is gone, someone took her. And if someone took her, they had to know enough about her to understand what taking her would require. On the evening of January 31st, Nancy spent time at her daughter Annie's home. This was not unusual. Family dinners were routine. The evening was described by those who were there as completely normal. Conversation, food, the kind of ordinary interaction that means nothing in the moment, but becomes critical when it is the last confirmed normalcy someone experiences. Annie's husband, Tommaso, was present. At some point later that evening, he drove Nancy home. This is not disputed. He took her back to her residence in Catalina Foothills, waited to see her enter safely, watched the garage door open, saw her go inside, and then left. That moment became the last confirmed visual sighting of Nancy Guthrie alive. But here is where the timeline becomes less about observation and more about data. Because in the modern age, people do not just disappear from human sight, they disappear from digital networks. And those networks remember everything. 1:47 in the morning, Nancy's doorbell camera goes offline. Now, cameras fail all the time. Connections drop, systems glitch. But this was not a glitch. Investigators believe the system was accessed remotely, not hacked in the way you see in movies, where someone guesses passwords frantically. Accessed using credentials, the correct credentials, which means whoever interrupted that camera system did not break in digitally. They logged in, they knew how, and they knew when. 41 minutes later, At 2:28 in the morning, Nancy's pacemaker transmitted its last signal. Pacemakers do not simply stop unless the heart stops or the device is separated from the body. Either scenario means something catastrophic. The pacemaker logged every heartbeat, every irregularity, every moment of cardiac activity until that exact timestamp, 2:28. And then, nothing. 41 minutes. That is the window. That is the entire operational time frame for everything that happened inside that house. And 41 minutes is not long unless you know exactly what you need to do. Unless you have already planned every movement. Unless this is not the first time you have been there. When investigators arrived at Nancy's home, they were not walking into chaos. They were walking into something that looked almost normal. Almost. But normal has details. And the details here did not align. There was no forced entry, no broken windows, no shattered locks, no signs that someone had fought their way inside. That immediately narrows the possibilities. Because in residential crimes involving intrusion, entry points leave evidence. Frames splinter, glass breaks, locks show stress. None of that existed here, which tells you something crucial. Whoever entered that home did not need to force their way in. They either had access, or Nancy let them in. Both possibilities require familiarity. Then there was the door, propped open, not broken, not kicked in, propped, as if someone needed it to stay open, as if they were moving something, or someone. And then, the blood. Not a lot, not a scene of violence that screams struggle, just presence. Blood on the porch. Enough to indicate something happened, not enough to tell you what. Inside, Nancy's medication sat untouched. The very medication she needed to survive. Her pacemaker accessories, the items required to monitor and maintain the device keeping her alive, left behind. If Nancy had left on her own, she would have taken these things. If someone had taken her and cared whether she lived, they would have brought them. Neither happened, which tells investigators something about intent. This was not about preservation. This was about removal. By now, search teams were mobilizing. Helicopters scanning open desert terrain. Ground units moving through the Catalina foothills. Volunteers organizing. Family members standing in front of cameras, asking the public for help. And in the middle of all that visible action, there was someone whose silence became impossible to ignore. Tommaso, Nancy's son-in-law, the last confirmed person to see her. He made no public statements, no emotional appeals, no tearful requests for her safe return. That absence of behavior does not prove anything. But in missing persons investigations, behavior matters. Because people react. They react visibly, emotionally, desperately. And when someone does not, investigators notice, that does not make him guilty. It makes him a question, and questions need answers. At the same time, investigators began doing what they always do in cases like this. They started reconstructing the environment. Not just the house, the entire area. Because understanding how someone could move through Catalina foothills without being noticed requires understanding what normal looks like there. And in a neighborhood where people know their surroundings, where routines are predictable, normal is everything. If you want to operate outside normal, you need cover. You need a reason to be there that does not raise suspicion. And that is exactly what investigators started looking for. Two things stood out almost immediately: a rental property nearby and construction activity in the same area. On the surface, these seem unrelated, but operationally, they share something critical. Both provide environmental permission. The rental gives someone a reason to be present, to move in and out, to exist in that space without anyone questioning why. Construction does the same thing. Vehicles appear. People move around. Activity happens at odd hours. And none of it seems out of place, because construction is inherently disruptive. It is supposed to look unusual. That makes it perfect cover. Now take that idea and apply it to the timeline. Because this is where the case stops being about February 1st and starts being about something longer. Something that stretches back weeks. January 11th. A masked individual appears at Nancy Guthrie's front door. Not breaking in, not forcing entry, just present, standing there, and then leaving. When investigators reviewed this incident, they described it in very specific language. A test, not an attempt, a test. Because if you are planning something, you do not start with execution. You start with observation. You test response times. You test visibility. You test whether anyone notices. You learn what happens when you do something small, so that when you do something larger, you already know what to expect. January 20th to 4th. Another date flagged by investigators. The specifics have not been made public, but the family has asked people to focus on this date, to check their cameras, to revisit what they might have seen, which tells you this is not random. This is part of a sequence. January 11th, January 20th to 4th, February 1st. 3 points, not isolated incidents. A progression, and progression means planning. Now return to the night of the disappearance. If someone had been watching, if someone had tested the environment, if someone understood the layout of the home, the timing of routines, the operation of the security system, then 41 minutes is not a problem. 41 minutes is enough. Enough to disable a camera. Enough to enter a home. Enough to remove a person. Enough to move them somewhere else. Enough to disappear before anyone realizes what happened. But only if you already know what you are doing. Only if this is not improvised. Only if you have prepared. And preparation is exactly what the evidence suggests. Law enforcement moved quickly to seize the vehicle used to drive Nancy home that night. Vehicles are controlled environments. They hold data, fibers, trace evidence, biological material, transfer patterns, and sometimes they reveal timelines that contradict what people say. The vehicle was not evidence on its own, but it was connected to Nancy's last confirmed movement. And in cases like this, everything connected to the last confirmed movement matters. At the same time, digital forensics teams began building something else: cellular mapping. Every phone that connects to a cell tower leaves a record. Not just that it was there, but when it was there, and how long it stayed. In a missing persons case, that data becomes a map, not of one device, of all of them. Thousands of devices reduced to hundreds. Hundreds reduced to dozens. And from those dozens, patterns emerge. Devices that appeared near Nancy's home on January 11th. Devices that appeared again on January 24th. Devices that were present in the area on February 1st. And devices that changed behavior during the critical window. Phones that were on, then went off. Devices that were stationary, then moved. Movement that was not random. Movement that had direction. Because here is what investigators realized. After 2:28 in the morning, certain devices began moving away from the residential area. Not in every direction. In one direction. Away from Catalina foothills, toward less visible terrain, toward the desert. And that direction became the focus of search efforts. Not because it proved anything, but because it aligned. Digital movement matched geographic possibility. And when data aligns with environment, you follow it. If you are still watching, you are exactly the kind of person who pays attention to details. The kind of person who understands that cases are built on pattern, not assumption. That is why you need to subscribe to True Crime Files. Hit that like button, because this case is not over, and the next piece of information that breaks it wide open could come from someone just like you. While search teams were moving through desert terrain, another unit was doing something quieter. DNA analysis. Forensic teams had recovered biological material from the scene, but it was not simple. It was mixed, multiple contributors, and mixed samples create a different kind of challenge. You cannot just run them through a database and get a match. You have to separate the profiles first. You have to isolate each contributor. And that takes time. It takes software. It takes precision. Because one mistake, one contaminated reading, one misidentified marker, and the entire sample becomes unusable in court. So while the public waited for answers, forensic analysts were working through a process that cannot be rushed. Separating profiles, building statistical models, comparing markers, running elimination samples against family members, against anyone who had legitimate reason to be in that home. And slowly, contributor by contributor, the picture was becoming clearer. At the same time, investigators returned to the neighborhood. But this was different. The first round of canvassing had been broad. Knock on every door. Ask general questions. Did you see anything unusual? Did you hear anything? Standard procedure. But the second round was not broad. It was targeted. Residents described federal agents asking very specific questions. Not did you see something? Did you see someone? And they were asking for names. Specific names. That shift tells you something important. The investigation had moved past the wide phase. It had entered the narrow phase. And narrow means focus. It means investigators were no longer trying to understand what happened. They were trying to confirm who made it happen. The rental property became a focal point. Two conflicting timelines emerged. One version suggested the occupants had left before February 1st. Another suggested they left immediately after. Both cannot be true. But both point to the same operational question. Why does that property matter? Because whether it was empty before the event or vacated immediately after, it creates a window. A window where no one is watching. Where activity does not get reported, where movement does not get remembered, and in an environment like Catalina Foothills, where visibility is constant, a window of invisibility is everything. Construction activity was examined with the same intensity. Who was working in the area? What companies had contracts? What vehicles were present? What hours did they operate? Because if you need to move through a neighborhood without raising suspicion, you do not dress like a criminal. You dress like a worker. You drive a work vehicle. You carry tools. You look like you belong. And no one questions you. Now combine those two elements. A rental property that might have been empty. Construction activity that provided legitimate cover. Cellular data showing devices moving in a specific direction. DNA samples being processed. A 41-minute window that fits perfectly if someone already knew what they were doing. And a timeline that stretches back weeks, suggesting this was not spontaneous. This is not a random crime. This is not opportunistic. This is structured. And structure requires more than intent. It requires knowledge. Knowledge of Nancy's home. Knowledge of her routines. Knowledge of her medical needs. Knowledge of her security system. Knowledge of when she would be vulnerable. Knowledge of how to move through that neighborhood without being noticed. Knowledge of where to go. After, that kind of knowledge does not come from observation alone. It comes from access, repeated access, familiarity, and that brings the case back to the people closest to Nancy, because proximity is not guilt, but proximity is opportunity, and opportunity is what investigators measure. Tommaso Sion remained a figure of interest, not because he was charged. He was not because he was accused. He was not. But because the facts placed him inside the timeline. He drove Nancy home. He was the last confirmed person to see her. He had access to her home. He would have known her routines. He would have understood her vulnerabilities. Those are not accusations. Those are circumstances. And circumstances are what investigations follow. At one point, authorities made a public statement. The family had been cleared through interviews, cleared through evidence review. Cleared through DNA comparison. That statement should have ended the public speculation, but it did not. Because, at the same time, journalist Ashley Banfield reported that law enforcement sources were still discussing Tommaso as a potential central figure in the case. Not charged, not confirmed, but discussed. That contradiction tells you something about modern investigations. There is what is said publicly, and there is what is happening internally. Those two narratives are rarely the same because investigations are not built for public consumption. They are built for prosecution, and prosecution requires certainty. So while the public hears cleared, investigators are still working through possibilities, still testing theories, still waiting for the final piece that turns theory into fact. And that final piece is often DNA, because DNA does not suggest. DNA places. It says you were here. Not near here, here, and in a case built on access and familiarity, placement is everything. By now the investigation had developed a rhythm, not the frantic energy of the first days. not the public urgency of search operations, but the controlled, methodical pace of forensic work, labs processing samples, analysts reviewing data, investigators cross-referencing timelines, attorneys reviewing legal standards for warrants. Every step measured, every conclusion tested, because once action is taken, it has to hold. Every detail, every connection, every piece of evidence has to survive scrutiny, not just from defense attorneys, from judges, from juries, from appellate courts. That is why cases like this take time, not because nothing is happening, but because everything must be right. And while that process continued behind closed doors, Nancy's family did something different. They released a public statement, not focused on theories, not focused on suspects, focused on information. They asked people to check their cameras, to revisit their memories, to focus on 3 specific dates: January 11th, January 31st, February 1st. They offered a reward, $1 million from the family, $100,000 from the FBI, $1.1 million total, completely anonymous, no need for certainty, no need for proof, just details. Because in cases like this, the detail that breaks everything open often comes from someone who did not realize what they saw mattered, someone who noticed a vehicle parked in the wrong place, someone who saw a person walking at an unusual hour, someone who heard something that seemed insignificant at the time. Memory is not perfect, but memory combined with digital records, with camera footage, with cell tower data, becomes something stronger. It becomes corroboration. And corroboration is what turns suspicion into evidence. At this point in the case, investigators were working with several confirmed pieces: a controlled environment, no forced entry, remote access to the security system, a 41-minute operational window, a pacemaker that stopped transmitting, blood on the porch, medication left behind, a last confirmed sighting by a family member, pattern of pre-incident activity, cellular data showing directional movement toward the desert, mixed DNA samples in process, a rental property with conflicting timelines, construction activity, providing environmental cover, and a victim who needed medical intervention to survive, but whose medical supplies were abandoned. Every one of those facts is documented. Every one of those facts is verifiable, and every one of those facts points in the same direction. This was not random. This was not impulsive. This was planned, and planning leaves evidence. But evidence is not the same as answers, because the one question that has driven this case from the beginning remains unanswered. Where is Nancy Guthrie? Search teams have covered miles of desert terrain. Helicopters have scanned open land. Ground units have moved through areas identified by cellular data. Cadaver dogs have been deployed. Forensic teams have processed locations flagged by the investigation. And still, nothing. No confirmed sighting, no remains, no resolution. That absence creates 2 possibilities. Either Nancy is somewhere that has not been searched yet, or Nancy is somewhere that cannot be found easily. Both possibilities require the same thing: someone knowing where to put her. And that brings the case back to preparation. Because if you are going to remove someone from a controlled environment in 41 minutes and ensure they are not found for over 60 days, you have to know where you are going. You cannot figure that out in the moment. You have to know beforehand, which means the answer to where Nancy is might not be in the physical search. It might be in the digital evidence, in the cell tower data that shows movement, in the patterns that reveal repeated visits to specific areas before February 1st, in the devices that traveled to locations that should not have mattered, but suddenly do. And that is where the investigation is now, not expanding, narrowing, not searching everywhere, searching specific places. Places connected to data, places connected to pattern, places connected to people who had the knowledge, the access, and the time to prepare. This is not about what could have happened. This is about what fits. And what fits is becoming clearer. But clarity is not closure. Clarity is structure. And structure is what allows investigators to move from theory to action, from suspicion to evidence, from questions to answers. Before this goes any further, there is something more important than analysis. If you have any information about this case, no matter how small it seems, now is the time. Call the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI. That is 1-800-225-5324. You can submit tips online. You can remain completely anonymous. You do not need certainty. You do not need proof. You just need detail. Because investigators build cases. You provide the pieces. And in cases like this, one piece changes everything. Nancy Guthrie is not a headline. She is a person, a mother, a grandmother, someone who deserves to be found. And this case is not over, not until she is. If you believe in justice, if you believe in accountability, subscribe to True Crime Files. Hit that like button. Because stories like this do not end until people like you decide they matter. 63 days. That is how long Nancy has been missing. 63 days of forensic analysis. 63 days of digital mapping. 63 days of search operations. 63 days of a family waiting for an answer. And 63 days of an investigation that has moved from chaos to structure, from everywhere to somewhere, from maybe to likely. The timeline is locked. 1:47 to 2:28. 41 minutes. The environment is understood. Catalina foothills. Controlled, visible, predictable. The method is clear. Remote access. No forced entry. Preparation. The pattern is documented. January 11th. January 20th to 4th. February 1st. The data is directional. Devices moving away from the residential area toward the desert. The forensics are in process. DNA separation, profile comparison, elimination testing, and the investigation has a focus. Not broad, not speculative. Specific. Built on people who had access. People who had knowledge. People who had opportunity. People whose behavior does not align with innocence, not because behavior proves guilt, but because behavior raises questions, and questions demand answers. Tommaso has not been charged. He has not been arrested. He has not been named a suspect in any official capacity, but his name is inside this investigation, inside the timelines, inside the access points, inside the behavioral analysis. Inside the questions that remain unanswered. That is not accusation. That is fact. And facts are what guide everything forward. At the same time, investigators are building something else. A case that does not rely on one piece of evidence. A case that relies on accumulation, on pattern, on convergence. Because modern prosecutions are not built on single smoking guns. They are built on layers. Digital evidence layered with forensic evidence, layered with behavioral evidence, layered with opportunity, layered with timeline. And when those layers align, they create something stronger than any single element could. They create inevitability. But inevitability requires patience. It requires precision. It requires every piece being tested and retested until it cannot be disputed. And that process is not fast. It is thorough. And thorough is what ensures accountability. The DNA results will come. The cellular data will be fully mapped. The search will continue. The interviews will be revisited. The timelines will be cross-referenced again. And at some point, the question will shift. Not, where is Nancy Guthrie, but who put her there? And when that question is answered, everything else follows. Because this case is not about mystery. This is about method. And method is something investigators understand. They understand preparation. They understand access. They understand motive. They understand opportunity. They understand how someone moves from intent to action, from planning to execution, from presence to absence. And they understand how to reverse that process, how to take absence and reconstruct presence, how to take silence and extract sound, how to take a 41-minute window and fill it with facts. That is what is happening now, not publicly, not in headlines, but in labs, in interviews, in data centers, in coordination between local, state, and federal agencies. This is not a cold case. This is an active investigation, and active means moving. means building, means closing in. Nancy Guthrie disappeared on February 1st, 2025. She has been missing for 63 days. Her pacemaker stopped transmitting at 2:28 in the morning. Her security camera went offline at 1:47. Her medication was left behind. Her family has offered over $1 million for information. Federal agents have returned to her neighborhood with specific questions. Digital analysts have identified patterns in cellular data. Forensic teams are processing mixed DNA samples. Search operations continue in areas identified by investigative focus. And through all of it, one question remains. Where is Nancy Guthrie? That question is not rhetorical. It is operational. It is the question driving every search, every analysis, every interview, every warrant. Because until Nancy is found, the case cannot close, the family cannot grieve, the community cannot heal, and justice cannot be served. But the answer is coming, not because investigators hope it will, but because the structure is forming, the pieces are aligning, the pattern is clear, and patterns do not lie, they reveal. And what this pattern reveals is that someone knew exactly what they were doing, someone who understood that environment, someone who had access to that home, someone who could move through that neighborhood without raising alarm, someone who knew how to disable a security system, someone who had 41 minutes and used every second efficiently, someone who planned this weeks in advance, someone who tested their approach, someone who executed with precision, someone who moved Nancy Guthrie from presence to absence and thought they could sustain that absence indefinitely. But absence is not erasure. Absence is evidence. And evidence is what investigators collect, piece by piece, layer by layer, until the structure is complete. This case will be solved. Not today, not with speculation, not with assumption, but with facts, with data, with forensics, with testimony, with the accumulated weight of everything that has been gathered over 63 days of relentless investigation. And when it is solved, when the answer to where is Nancy Guthrie is finally known, the next question will be immediate. Who is responsible? And that question will have an answer too. Because responsibility is not abstract. Responsibility is documented in timelines, in access points, in digital records, in biological evidence, in behavioral patterns, in opportunity, in motive. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She had a family. She had a life. She had a home. She had routines and relationships and a right to exist without fear. Someone took that from her. Someone planned it. Someone executed it. Someone thought they could get away with it. But investigations do not forget. Evidence does not disappear. And justice does not expire. This is the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. A case built on 41 minutes. A case built on pattern and preparation. A case built on questions that demand answers. And those answers are coming. If you care about cases like this, if you believe that every person matters, that every disappearance deserves investigation, that every family deserves truth, then subscribe to True Crime Files. Hit that like button. Share this story. Because attention keeps cases alive. Attention keeps investigators funded. Attention keeps the public engaged. And engagement leads to tips. Tips lead to evidence. Evidence leads to answers. And answers lead to justice. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. The investigation is still active. The search is still ongoing. The forensic work is still in process. The digital analysis is still being refined. And somewhere, someone knows something. Someone saw something. Someone heard something. Someone has the detail that connects everything. That someone could be you. 1-800-CALL-FBI. 1-800-225-5324. Anonymous. Rewarded. Critical. Because this case is not over. Not until Nancy comes home. Not until the person responsible is held accountable. Not until the 41-minute window is fully reconstructed. Not until every question has an answer. Where is Nancy Guthrie? That question haunts this investigation. It haunts her family. It haunts the community. And it should haunt whoever is responsible, because the answer is coming. And when it does, everything changes. This is True Crime Files. This is the case that proves preparation leaves patterns. And patterns lead to people. And people are held accountable. Nancy Guthrie deserves that. Her family deserves that. And the truth, no matter how long it takes, will demand it.